Dobar dan, mi smo učenice 3. razreda Tehničke gimnazije u Tehničkoj školi Ruđera Boškovića Vinkovci, Marija Jerković, Maja Stipić
Petra Skoče-Bušić i Nika Fizi.
I naša mentorica je Mirela Dobutović. The love affair between science and poetry. Scientists and poets are more alike than you might think. Are you ready?
Yep, let's do it.
Good.
Science naturally is quite a technical subject, and sort of creative outlets might not come naturally, but I definitely think it's worth pursuing. I've got a book on lasers here, 50 years of discoveries. I think that might be quite good for emotive language. Like after a day of studying physics, being able to write something that's just totally different is quite liberating. I hope there's some good stuff saying, oh my god, lasers are really exciting, this is why they're, you know, fantastic. The poetry collection that I'm releasing at the moment is largely to do with people in my life and experiences that I've had, and it's mainly just a way to get out how I'm feeling. Yeah, I'll just stick with these. Okay, so I'm just going to try and find a sentence to start off with and see what happens. I think physics and sciences in general could do with a bit more creativity. You see it a little bit with some papers, but definitely a lot more as public understanding of science grows, because you need it to be more accessible. So with a lot of the poetry that I write, it's kind of free verse, so it's less structured, less kind of you need to have this many syllables in a line kind of thing, and more so just a bit more abstract prose, I guess. That was difficult. I'd like to talk about a part that is unknown, the truth that is equal and not, an exciting performance, centuries in the making, filled with deep symmetries, dreams afield and ghostly fingers, a question struggled and a question answered. I was kind of going down the path where I was just basically trying to think about what physics is like, and if there's anything that I could just pull from these books. So it was mainly about like trying to figure things out and how long it's taken for people to get here. Because I think that's something that a lot of people don't realise, is that physics is like a massive culmination of knowledge that's been going on for like thousands of years, and like with science as well, more generally speaking, like it is a culmination of people's work.
Poetry and science seem like opposites, but the two have long been intertwined. However, science and poetry haven't always got along. For example, the English poet John Keats, who also trained as a medical doctor, famously wrote the following in his narrative poem Lamia in 1819. Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture. She is given in the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnawed mine, and weave a rainbow as it erewhile made the tender person Lamia melt into a shade. Here Keats criticizes the way in which natural philosophy, the name for natural science prior to the mid-19th century, removes the magic from a world that is more accurately captured in poetry. William Blake is another writer who is even more specific in his references to science. He stated that at the moment of apocalypse, science has a role to play in the redemption of the world, but now we recognize the participants. The innumerable chariots of the Almighty appeared in heaven, and Bacon and Newton and Locke and Milton and Shakespeare and Chaucer. He even wrote, "My task is, in the grandeur of inspiration, to cast off rational demonstration, to cast off Bacon, Locke, and Newton. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create." And yet, on the other side, we can see long-term filtration of poetry and science and depth of their romance. Here is just a small number of people who immersed their lives in both science and poetry. In the late 1700s, scientific treatises were written in a poetic form because poetry was considered the language of intellect and the future. In the 1800s, Lewis Carroll experimented with mathematical logic to create the square stanza. And who can forget Dante's The Divine Comedy, a smokescreen of history and religion which at its damning best was underpinned by solid science such as the action of gravity as he travels to the core of the earth and on Lucifer's fall through the galaxy. This very tendency to reduce things to their minute components is science's premise, and so it is sometimes criticized for losing sight of the wholeness and larger human meaning. John Keats, who trained as a surgeon and apothecary before committing himself to poetry, famously said, "There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her roof, her texture. She is given in the dull catalogue of common things." This roughly translates as science ruins the beauty of things by dissecting it into its components. It's worth noting, though, that Keats was a part of the Romantic era wherein poets were confronted by the Industrial Revolution, and the idea that science and technology would pave the way for the future was for them terrifying. Of all the Romantics, Lord Byron and Percy Shelley were the ones most interested in science and most aware of the new scientific developments in their age. Shelley was intrigued by chemistry as early as his student days at Oxford, and showed so much promise in the field that the great philosopher of science. Shelley and Byron took a special interest in emerging fields of geology and paleontology, and in particular kept up with the latest theories about the prehistoric creatures that came to be known as dinosaurs. This kind of scientific development fed the religious skepticism of Shelley and Byron, and above all their tendency to question the biblical account of creation. Both Shelley and Byron were fascinated by what was happening in astronomy and cosmology in their day, a fascination that is reflected in the cosmic speculations that appear in poems such as Shelley's Prometheus Sunbound or Byron's Cain.
Monarch of gods and demons, and all spirits but one, who throng those bright and rolling worlds which thou and I alone of living things behold with sleepless eyes. Regard this earth, made multitudinous with thy slaves, whom thou requitest for new worship, prayer and praise, and toil, and hecatombs of broken hearts, with fear and self-contempt and barren hope. Whilst me, who am thy foe, eyeless and hate, hast thou made reign and triumph to thy scorn o'er mine own misery and thy vain revenge. 3,000 years of sleep unsheltered hours, and moments I divided by keen pangs till they seem years, torture and solitude, scorn and despair. These are mine empire, more glorious far than that which thou surveyest from thine unenvied throne, O mighty God. Almighty, had I deigned to share the shame of thine ill tyranny, and hung not here, nailed to this wall of eagle-baffling mountain, black, wintry, dead, unmeasured, without herb, insect or beast, or shape or sound of life. Ah me! Alas, pain, pain ever, for ever!
And this is life. Toil, 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 toil. And wherefore should I toil? Because my father could not keep his place in Eden. What had I done in this? I was unborn. I sought not to be born, nor love the state to which that bird has brought me. Why? Why did he yield to the serpent and the woman? Or ailing? Why suffer what was there in this? And the tree planted. The tree planted. And why not for him? If not for him, why place him near it, where it grew the furthest in the center? but one answer to all questions. Do as his will. And he is good. He is good. How know I that? How know I that? Because he is all-powerful, must all good too follow? Good. I judge by the fruits, and they are better. Why do I exist? Why are all things wretched? Even he who made us, must be as the maker of things unhappy. To produce destruction can surely never be the task of joy, and yet Messiah says he's omnipotent. Then why is evil he being good? I asked this question to my father. And he said, because this evil only was the path to good. Strange good. Strange good.
We find a similar complexity in Wordsworth's attitude towards science when we examine his writings carefully. To be sure, he often laments the impact of modern science and technology on the realm of nature, and, like Blake, he also regards the domination of the scientific worldview as a threat to the imagination. It is less well known, however, that at times Wordsworth speculated that science might open up imaginative possibilities for poetry. If people in the 19th century had been asked, who is the wisest man in Europe, many would have answered, Goethe. But in the 20th century, if the same question had been posed, we very much doubt that many people would have offered a poet or an imaginative writer as their answer. We would venture to say that the most common answer in the 20th century to the question, who is the wisest man, would have been Albert Einstein. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe is perhaps the biggest exception to the norm. A German and born in 1749, he was a writer and scientist, but he always regarded his contribution to the science of color far greater than any literature he wrote. His work includes poetry written in a variety of meters and styles, prose and verse dramas, memoirs, and autobiography, literary criticism, papers on botany, anatomy, and color, and 4 novels. One of his biggest passions was the study of clouds, and in an act of pronounce and love and respect between a poet and a scientist, he wrote a poem about each of the different classifications of clouds: nimbus, cirrus, cumulus, and stratus, and an ode to the scientist who devised them, Luke Howard, as a declaration of his admiration for Howard's scientific skills. To find yourself in the infinitive, you must distinguish and then combine. Therefore, my winged song thanks the man who distinguished cloud from cloud. Goethe is an exception in many respects, and thus his ability to combine the talents of a poet and scientist does not tell us much about the general run of poets, but it does at least offer the evidence that science and poetry are not utterly incompatible. Today, many poets embrace and explore both the confirmed and the working theories of physics, astronomy, and nature. the most popular scientific fields for poets. The idea of scientists as poets is surprisingly common, a variation of the writer with day job. Ada Lovelace was the estranged daughter of the Romantic poet Lord Byron, who, shortly after his daughter's birth, was exiled to Greece amid rumors of incest. Lovelace's mother, Annabella, committed herself to securing the finest scientific education for her daughter that was available at the beginning of the 19th century. Lovelace excelled as a student. Early on in her tuition, she was introduced to the English mathematician Charles Babbage and his work on the analytical engine. The designs of this machine, which was never fully built during Babbage's lifetime, share many properties of modern computers, including hard copy printouts and the ability to plot graphs. While Babbage designed and created this incredible piece of engineering, it was Lovelace who saw its true potential. Despite her mother's misgivings, she had continued to write poetry, later reflecting that her insight was made possible because of this rebellion. The analytical engine was designed by Babbage to perform complex mathematical calculations, but Lovelace theorized that the engine could be capable of any task if programmed correctly, even composing music or writing poetry. Ruth Padel, whose great-great-grandfather is Charles Darwin, has dedicated much of her work to the amalgamation of the two, including a book of poems on Charles Darwin's writings, letters, and journals to explore his life, family, and science. Humphrey Davy was another scientist who has also an accomplished poet. He discovered the elements sodium and potassium, among others, and his poetry was celebrated by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In some of his earliest research, Davy was tasked with investigating the medical benefits of nitrous oxide. He quickly realized the euphoric effects of the compound and gave it the alternative name laughing gas in 1800. Davy continued to make detailed notes about the effects that the gas had on his mental and physical state. He recorded some of these early experiments in verse. The poem on breathing the nitrous oxide clearly shows his writing has affected by the gas.
On Breathing the Nitrous Oxide by Humphrey Davy. Not in the ideal dreams of wild desire have I beheld a rapture-wakening form. My bosom burns with no unhallowed fire, yet is my cheek with rosy blushes warm. Yet are my eyes with sparkling lustre filled, yet is my mouth implete with murmuring sound, yet are my limbs with inward transports thrilled, and clad with newborn mightiness around.
A more recent example of a scientist whose life and research were strongly influenced by poetry is the Canadian astronomer Rebecca Elson. Elson was one of the first scientists to use measurements from the Hubble Space Telescope to look back into the early stages of the universe. In her poem, Aberration, Elson reveals the frustrations of coming so close to the desired goal, and in doing so explores the concept of failure, which is so critical to scientific endeavor. It is only through poetry that physicist Elson felt able to express her emotional ambivalence.
Aberration by Rebecca Elson. The Hubble Space Telescope before repair. The way they tell it, all the stars have wings. The sky so full of wings, there is no sky. And just for a moment, you forget the error and the crimped paths of light, and you see it, the immense migration, and you hear the rush, the beating.
Perhaps the most absolute of the similarities between scientists and poets is the pungent sense of redundancy that at times underpins their work. Sam Illingworth is a lecturer in science communication at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. His research involves looking at the ways in which science interacts with society via different cultural media.
I love that idea that a poet and a scientist do very similar kinds of things because it seems like opposite. You know, you think science, serious, data-driven, analytical, poet, loosey-goosey, freewheeling, and yet both of them are very focused on observation, on details, on the sensory experience of the world. And a poet is trying to capture a moment, an image, a place, an animal in very specific language to create an image that you can understand and see instantly. And a scientist is trying to do a very similar thing, very explicit observation. What exactly am I seeing? Using just the right words, perhaps for different purposes, but a very similar approach. And the more I got into this, the more I saw that scientists really love poetry and appreciate that about poetry. And I think maybe poets are not as aware that science is poetry friendly. So it's been fun to make that bridge and have people see the overlap and connections.
Poetry and science are united. They address the big questions of life. By focusing on detail on particular characteristics, neither poetry nor science is allowed to be vague. For poets, it may be the characteristics of each feeling, each mood, and each notion, and for the scientists, it is the characteristics of the object, the curve of the seashell that lets us know it's a seashell. Adding an idea from one place to an idea from somewhere else to make something that perfectly sums up the thing itself, says Emily Dodd. It's about seeing patterns in the world and translating them into something others can engage with. The best scientists and poets can do that. Both too depend on metaphor as the manner by which thought is explained to lay reader. Many poets have used scientific imaginary to evoke metaphorical imagery, such as the 16th century priest and lawyer John Donne. A certain amount of logic too is required, even for a poem. To have a thought and see it through to conclusion is the basic premise of both experimentation and writing. Additionally, both strive to drive forward thought and introspection once their job has been done. For the poet, it's introspection in the reader or listener's mind, and for the scientist, it is to examine their process and where they may have gone wrong. It seems then more collaboration between the two will bring a greater understanding to our world. Perhaps William Wordsworth put it best. If the time should ever come when what is now called science, thus familiarized to men, shall be ready to put on, as it were, a form of flesh and blood, the poet will lend his divine spirit to aid the transfiguration, and will become the being thus produced, as a dear and genuine inmate of the household of man. Or Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Science arose from poetry. When times change, the two can meet again on higher levels as friends.